What we're talking about here, the first debate before either of the conventions have even happened, the commission not being involved, no live audience, potentially a mute button. How unusual are these debates going to be?
Well, just about every characteristic that you've just named is unusual, and certainly to start off this early. But given that we know which the candidates will be of each of the two major parties, I guess that part is not so surprising. And I was saying this morning to someone that at least it adds a little bit of normalcy to a very abnormal situation in this country, in our political context, and in this election for 2024, the president of the United States.
I realize, Barbara, not everyone is in mourning over the loss of another institution in the Commission on Presidential Debates, but there was a purpose for it to be there, not only to establish dates, locations, and so forth, help to negotiate the rules, but it was about making this accessible to all Americans, which is why this is one of the most watched things that happens every 4 years on all of the channels. In this case, you're going to be on one cable news network. So the prospect here is either people not seeing the debate in a worst case, or the candidates trying to game each other out for a moment that will last on social media. How does that end up impacting the race?
Well, shocking that we should have a different situation in this time and this place of 2024 and these two already unprecedented candidates by virtue of their ages. So that's obviously going to be unusual. We mentioned the date starting at the end of June. And I guess I would ask, in addition to having it only on one cable network, though people are used to finding things the way they want to find them, sometimes just on social media or sometimes watching things rerun on YouTube, if you will. Better in the days of when these started in 1960 with Kennedy and Nixon, the first televised debates. I know that the channels that we could watch in the 1960s on our old TV when I was growing up, there were two. We could watch CBS or NBC. We didn't even get ABC at the time. So people are used to being able to find what they want to find. My question would be, at the end of June, in the middle of the summer, how many Americans who aren't already tuning in to things like this are going to tune in? And that makes me a little sad. I think it would have been better to wait until the fall, frankly.
Well, Barbara, you mentioned something there about the age of both of these individuals. Not only are we talking about someone in their late 70s, someone in their early 80s, we are talking about two presidents, a former and a current, whose policies are not only pretty well known, they've already been experienced by the American people who have already felt the effects. So to what extent are any of these debates actually going to be about policy and substance as much as they are about performance and proving that you have the stamina and wherewithal for such a thing?
They're always about performance, as is everything on television and on a screen. It's always about how someone performs. So that's number one. Number two, I should think that at least President Biden will want to talk about issues, particularly those things he's accomplished in 4 years, but how he will make things better for those Americans who don't feel that they are better off than they were 4 years ago. So he'll try to make that case. And of course, Donald Trump could go in any direction, as we know, when he's on a stage, which makes it at least a little bit more exciting.
I guess there's that. We always have exciting, including the potential for these not to happen. You have to remember who we're talking about here. Donald Trump has not taken part in a debate in this cycle yet, and there were many who didn't think, to Kailey's point earlier, that would ever happen. To what extent is Joe Biden doing himself potentially a disservice here? If the polls were more in his favor, do you think he would actually be going into a room with someone who has traditionally lied on the debate stage and disobeyed the rules?
I think that's a really good point, that the current president almost has to do this, first of all, to show that he's able to do it, but also because he's not far ahead in the polls. It may help him, as the State of the Union address did, where he had a good performance after so many people said, oh, he's gaffe prone and he's aging. So I think it's good for him in that way. But every person who puts himself or herself out on a presidential debate stage always runs the risk of a gaffe, or just not looking very good, as in the case of Nixon in 1960, bad makeup or no makeup, and he was sickly. He didn't look so good. But even somebody as skilled as Barack Obama had a first debate with Mitt Romney in 2012. It was a bad performance. Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, same thing in 1984. So even the best of them can have a bad outing, and Joe Biden and Donald Trump have to hope that that doesn't happen to them.
Barbara, earlier today on Balance of Power, we got the chance to speak with Dr. Bernice King, the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., and we asked her what she thinks President Biden needs to do to reach black voters specifically. This is what she told us.
The campaign can't speak. The people who have benefited from the administration, should I say, need to be speaking. Let me show you how this has impacted my life. The people who believe in what he's done as the president need to be speaking for him while he is the candidate and saying this is what he's done for our communities, our group.
Barbara, is the messaging for both President Biden and Donald Trump, for that matter, one better spread by other messengers?
I don't think so for Donald Trump, because he has shown that he can be, well received by those people who support him. Now, for those who are on the fence, it may be, harder for him to make his case. For Joe Biden, I think that Ms. King was absolutely right, that surrogates would very much help Joe Biden to make his case for black voters. And I would also say, be sure to put former President Barack Obama out on the stump at every opportunity to make the case to black Americans.